This story is a story of war. The Mesolithic rule of the red squirrel in Britain and the subsequent invasion of the grey squirrel in Victorian Britain that led to the near extinction of the native red. We're going to talk about grey squirrels and how they are a detriment to things like trees, native oak trees like this one here, for example. They hurt songbirds and most importantly they hurt red squirrels. There are many different ways they do this, which we're going to cover, and there are also many mitigation strategies of controlling the population of grey squirrels. These are things like culling is the most popular one. There's contraceptive measures, there's vaccination for the red squirrels. We're going to look into all of this. This will all be looked into, heavily researched. Enjoy. Red squirrels plant a lot of hazelnuts, whereas grey squirrels actually have a habit for completely disregarding them and stripping the bark of the hazel before the tree and the nuts are even ripe. Roughly 7,800 years ago in Mesolithic Britain, there was a red squirrel who one day went out searching for hazelnuts, collected a stash and buried some within the root of the hazel tree. 7,800 years later, there were a group of archaeologists who were digging in a site called the Gold Cliff site, which is near Newport in Wales, and what they found is these 7,800-year-old hazelnuts, thus being the oldest evidence we have recorded of red squirrels in Britain. The oldest physical remains were dug up in 1985 on the Isle of Wight, in an area known as Binnell Point. A skeleton of a red squirrel was stored for 4,500 years. It is likely, however, that they have been around since the last ice age, which is about 11,000 years ago. So there's a very high likelihood that red squirrels were around at the same time as woolly mammoths and saber-toothed cats. During the Iron Age, half of our ancient forests were torn down. And today, in 2024, we only have 2.5% of our ancient forests remaining. As a result of habitat loss, red squirrel populations started to slip through the net and decline. And populations in Scotland were virtually gone by the 18th and 19th centuries. They were gone from Sutherland by 1630, Moray by 1775, Ross and Cromarty by 1792 and Aberdeenshire by 1843. The year in which everything rapidly accelerated was 1876. It was then that Victorian banker Thomas Brocklehurst brought over 2 American grey squirrels from the continent, thus establishing just enough to create a whole breeding colony of what is now today 2.7 million. The 2 were dropped off at their new home in Cheshire and they settled in very quickly. Within 50 years it was considered almost fashionable nationwide to get your own pet grey squirrel. 100 of them were released in Surrey in 1902 and 91 were released in Regent's Park in 1905. By the 1950s, they'd colonised the country from Southampton to Yorkshire, and the colonisation of Wales was completed by the 1980s. It took until 1931 for the government to actually realise and acknowledge the detrimental impact that grey squirrels were having on our native flora and fauna. It was then, in 1931, that they released the first ever anti-grey squirrel campaign. And then 1 year later, in 1932, the UK government published the Destructive Imported Animals Act. This act made it illegal to hold a grey squirrel captive without a licence. At this point in the 1940s, attitudes towards grey squirrels were turning very, very, very sour. The Ministry of Food, for example, during the 1940s promoted the eating of squirrel soup and squirrel pie. Due to their adverse effects on our ecosystem, it was pretty well known at this point that grey squirrels were not welcome nor beneficial to our country. The Isle of Wight is a safe haven for red squirrels. If a grey ever gets onto the island, and right now there are none, it will be swiftly disposed of. I spoke to Helen Butler, MBE, who works on the Isle of Wight, lives on the Isle of Wight, knows these squirrels incredibly well, and we spoke about cases in which grey squirrels did get onto the island and what happened.
Back in the 50s, so he told me about it, he opened the back of his post van that come from the mainland and there was a grey in the back. Obviously it had to be dealt with. Another incident, again, I didn't experience it. It was very well documented because people do remember in the 70s, a grey got onto the boat in Portsmouth and the boat couldn't leave until they got the grey off. So even back then, before the publicity, it was known we don't have greys over here.
She said that
If you clear an area of greys and there's reds next door, as it were, then the reds will soon move in. So if they establish, that would be the end of this very important red colony of red squirrels.
Helen touches upon themes of culling and pest removal. But before we get into that, let's finish the timeline. In 1981, arguably the most impactful piece of wildlife legislation was passed. It was called the Wildlife and Countryside Act, and whilst it did see a whole lot of control and protection for native and non-native species alike, it really drew the line in the sand for grey squirrels. Under this 1981 law, it now meant that grey squirrels could no longer be freely released upon British land. Pair that with the 1932 law, which said that you cannot hold a grey squirrel captive without a licence. This now gave accidental squirrel harbourers a difficult choice, and the choice is kill the squirrel or pay somebody to kill the squirrel. In 1995, the Mammal Society declared emergency. They said that we are soon to lose all of our red squirrels in the country. 1 year later, in 1996, the Wild Mammals Protection Act was established. This gave both red and grey squirrels freedom from acts of cruelty. So this meant that for the grey squirrel, the only thing you could legally do to it was to kill it. Whilst there had been a lot of progress made in regards to culling grey squirrels, there hadn't been a lot of progress made in regards to protecting reds. But in 2004 this changed with the publication of the Scottish Nature Conservation Act. This now made it illegal by law, punishable by law, to intentionally harm, torture, injure or kill a red squirrel, or to disrupt the habitat of one. In 2018, the Mammal Review was published, which said there to be 239,000 red squirrels in Scotland, 39,000 red squirrels in England, and only 9,000 red squirrels in Wales. And the same report found there to be a grossly outnumbering amount of grey squirrels, placed at 2.7 million individuals. Up until 2019, the governing body Natural England had the authority to grant licences for the release of grey squirrels into the country. But in 2019 this changed with the Invasive Alien Species Order, which made it completely illegal under any circumstance for anybody to grant the authority for anybody to release any grey squirrel anywhere. With this gradual but deafening distaste towards grey squirrels, you may ask why? What's actually so bad about them? Well, there are three things that are bad about them, really. The first one is competition of resources, the second one is spread of disease, and the third is the death of woodland. Before the First World War, we actually imported 90% of our timber, so wood that's used for building. Mainly it came from Scandinavia. But after the war, the government kind of realised that our dependency on external importing wood is not really sustainable. So in 1919 they set up a commission called the Forestry Commission, whose main purpose, generally, apart from maintaining the forests, is to turn a profit and is to turn high yield production on British timber. Missing the days of former British timber glory, in which the Victorians built a 64-gun man-of-war battleship from New Forest oak, the government decided it's time to reclaim the wood. There are more ancient oak trees like this one here in England than there are everywhere else in Europe combined. Now, what tree faces the greatest threat by grey squirrels? It's oak. I spoke to an ecology writer called Jackie Foott to see what she had to say about the matter.
The grey squirrels will come along, and a tree which could potentially have been worth thousands of pounds is barely worth firewood. So the foresters are not planting hardwood.
Grey squirrels are known infamously for their sap collection process called ring barking. Ring barking is when they use their claws and their teeth to strip away the bark of trees, round and round in a ring, and they get the nutrients and the sap and the sugars underneath. This damages the tree, leaves it open to predation, disease, the elements, everything, and it can ultimately kill a lot of trees. Squirrels also get nesting materials from ring barking. But what ringbarking does to a tree is it stops the tree being able to flow nutrients and water up and down it, and in some cases can lead to starvation, malnourishment, and death of the tree. Grey squirrels have favourite trees they like to ringbark. They favour hazel, oak, sweet chestnut, but these are trees that are vital links in the food chain supply. These dense ancient woodland are the prime habitat for red squirrels, and only 2.5% of it is left. Our native red squirrels live at a population density of 1 per hectare. The American grey squirrels live at a population density of 10 per hectare. All these animals and plants around me, this native flora and fauna, these trees here, they all adapted to be able to withstand attacks from maybe 1 or 2 squirrels per hectare, but they didn't evolve to be able to withstand attacks from 10 or 20. Ethical implications aside, what people really care about is money, finance, economics, the bottom line. The Royal Forestry Society declared that there is between 37 and 67 million pounds of damage done by grey squirrels to commercial timber every year. Tree damage aside, one of the most worrying things about grey squirrels is how easily they intimidate, bully and predate upon smaller species. It's not just red squirrels that they hurt. They've been observed attacking and killing songbirds like robins and sparrows and blue tits. It extends beyond squirrel versus squirrel. Studies have shown that the life expectancy of a young red squirrel is reduced to only 13% when a grey squirrel is living nearby. First off is the physical advantage. Greys are bigger, simply put. Your average grey squirrel will weigh in at about 520 grams, whereas the red squirrel weighs in at an average of about 300 grams. What this means is that if there's any altercation, any dispute, any rivalry, the grey is going to win and the red is going to lose. They live in population densities that are 10 times higher than that of red squirrels, and they're stronger too. Oak acorns contain something called tannic acid or tannins. Tannins are actually toxic to humans if we don't cook them, and they're also toxic to red squirrels. Grey squirrels, however, can eat them just fine. So what this means is that historically, red squirrels will have planted an acorn more than they will have actually eaten it, which will lead to the growth of an oak tree. Whereas now, with the abundance of grey squirrels outweighing the reds, most of these acorns actually get eaten. The most consequential impact of grey squirrels upon reds is a spread of a disease known as squirrelpox. Squirrelpox in red squirrels is plainly horrific. It kills them in 4 to 5 days, and before it kills them, it treats them horribly and tortures them. It causes crusted eyes, swollen everything, pain, pus, bleeding, blindness. But the grey squirrels, coming from America, are immune. They're immune to squirrelpox. The squirrelpox virus lives in 80% of grey squirrels, and when these greys come into contact with reds via defecation, via a feeder, a water source, or a fight, it can ultimately lead to the red squirrels dying a horrible, slow, painful death. It was in 2007 when squirrelpox was first recorded in Scotland. It will be 2 years later, in 2009, when Formby, one of England's most isolated and precious red squirrel colonies, was subject to the pox, and because of it, it lost 87% of its population. In 2021, staff found 4 more red squirrels in Formby that were infected with squirrelpox, lowering the population to a mere 250. As Helen Butler puts it,
I don't see unless you get rid of the greys, how are you going to get rid of the squirrel pox?
Helen Butler, like many other conservationists, is in favour of grey squirrel culling. Now, whilst many people see it as a very touchy subject, cruel, evil, despicable, many other people see it as necessary. In order to save one species, we have to kill another. It's a sacrifice, so to speak. Squirrel culling is not actually a new thing. In fact, we began squirrel culling with the reds, not the greys. In 1889, in the New Forest, There were 2,200 red squirrels culled, and this was in the name of timber protection, so we could build battleships. In 1909, the Highland Squirrel Club killed 7,000 squirrels, red ones to be specific. 15 years later, that same culling measurement went from 7,000 down to 3,000. What this shows is, although gradual, in the early 20th century, people were slowly starting to warm up to the native red squirrels. But in later decades, the attention did turn towards the greys. In the 1930s, the Ministry of Agriculture started giving out free shotgun rounds to people willing to cull a grey squirrel. Then in the 1970s, they started using warfarin, which is a rat poison. As a nation, we actually spend £14 million per year on grey squirrel culling, but many people see it as the most effective solution and a necessary process to go through.
There's no natural predators of these invasive species, so you've got to get rid of them somehow. The only reason there are red squirrels in England, or in even the British Isles possibly, is because of the work that we have been doing over the last 30-odd years. Within Cumbria and Northumberland, we take out 20,000 grey squirrels a year. If we hadn't been doing the work we have been doing over the last 30, 40 years, we would have no red squirrel left in the north of England right now.
Systematic culling does have its issues, though. Simple population dynamics means that you can kill thousands of a species, and because there is now less competition for resources, there are now more resources like food and shelter available for the new animals being born. So you wipe out thousands of a population, which then just leaves more growth for a future population, thus increasing the population to a higher number than if you just left it alone in the first place. There is a distinct lack of public support, so it's difficult for organisations to find public funding. So culling must be done at a greater amount every single year. If you pair this with the fact that conservationists are really struggling to find funding, then they have got a difficult task on their hands. Some ecologists, like Patrick Barkham, suggest that it might not even be worth trying. He said that our ecosystem is so unbalanced that it might be futile to attempt to control it. Others are more neutral on the topic, though. Well-respected ecology writer George Monbiot said that the restoration of an ecosystem doesn't have to mean the complete decimation of one species, but it can do a suppression within the population of that species. When researching squirrel culling, my mind started to wander towards the more ethical implications of the whole thing. I had questions like, is it more ethical if you hunt an animal and then eat it compared to hunting an animal and leaving it? The culinary attitude towards grey squirrel has changed over time, but still there's never been an abundance of demand for these animals which are in abundance and have very lean, high quality meat. After World War II, the UK government launched a squirrel eating campaign, but it never really took off. Jackie Foott has decades of first-hand experience working with culling operations, so she knows what happens to the meat afterwards.
Most carcasses, we try and use them. So some will go to predator centres, bird centres. They've been used in the past for feeding red kite projects. They will go to, zoos sometimes. Grey squirrel is good food. It's good meat. Try it. For years now, there's been Cumbrian restaurants have grey squirrel on the menu.
The BBC actually published a piece in 2023 which promoted the dining of rodents at the hands of the Exmoor Squirrel Project. Grey squirrel has been said to have a nutty taste and to be absolutely delicious. As an alternative to culling, 61.5% of British people think that contraception, chemically, is the best way to get rid of the surplus population of grey squirrels. What this means is it means leaving out baited food for the grey squirrels to eat, which contains a chemical contraceptive. The problem here lies with efficacy. In one grey squirrel contraceptive trial, there was a reported 60% success rate. Now, while 60% wouldn't be world-ending on its own, you pair that with the difficulty of administration and you realise that you have to give the contraceptive to the squirrel 6 times over a month. And these are wild animals, something that is near impossible to do. Whilst birds are immune to these proposed contraceptives, animals like voles and mice are not immune. The use of bait-based chemicals doesn't just apply to the target demographic, it goes down the food chain. If you put out a hopper of seeds and nuts with a tainted chemical in that, it will not just be grey squirrels or red squirrels that go for it. It will be an amalgamation of other animals. It's also really hard to convince a squirrel to eat something between the months of September and December, because there's just so much natural food available that you put out a baited tray of seeds and a squirrel might have just enough natural food that it won't even be interested. All of these reasons for failure come together to describe why a red squirrel vaccination against squirrelpox is very difficult. Simply put, it's hard to give squirrels drugs.
The contraceptive would be wonderful, but the way it's going at the moment, I think it would be extremely expensive, and I don't think it will have a high enough efficacy rate. You need something with above, I would think, 95% efficacy.
The ground on which I stand right now was once home to a variety of megafauna, beautiful animals, carnivores, predators, giant herbivores, and they were wiped out. Why did we kill them? Because we were scared. It was driven by fear. The Eurasian brown bear, which is the most common bear in the world, lived right here up until about 1500 years ago. Eurasian lynx, which is a species now only really found in mountainous and forested remote areas of Europe, once roamed here too. They survived 200 years longer than the brown bear, dying out 1,200 years ago. And grey wolves were the longest surviving British apex predator, going right up until the 18th century, only 300 years ago. 100 years after the death of the wolf, the goshawk was wiped out. Probably the most adept aerial hunter to ever roam the skies. A goshawk diet mainly consists of medium-sized birds, such as pigeons or crows or magpies, and also small mammals, so sometimes a goshawk will go for a rabbit or even a grey squirrel. Squirrels have also been hunted historically and systematically by brown bears, grey wolves and the lynx. It's been estimated that pine martens, a small mustelid in the same family as otters and badgers and polecats, were once the second most abundant carnivorous predator in the UK. There were 150,000 of them just after the last ice age, about 11,000 years ago. They were hunted to near extinction by humans, but in 1981 they were afforded legal protection. And since then, they've been bouncing back, and there are now a few thousand of them, mostly in Scotland, but in the UK. A 1995 population survey found there to be 3,650 pine martens living in the UK today. Only 100 of those live in England. The reason that these native predators are so important is that without them, there's nothing to eat and hunt these surplus populations and these invasive species. So numbers of grey squirrels, they spiral out of control. Just one pair of breeding goshawks in a forest can provide enough population control to keep down invasive species. Or as James Aldred puts it, goshawks are the natural means of squirrel control. The Mesolithic goshawk population stood at a number of 14,000 breeding pairs. They were extinct by the 19th century, but then by the 1960s, they had made a gradual, very slight comeback via an array of intentional and unintentional releases. The loss of the goshawk coincides almost perfectly with the introduction of the grey squirrel, with only decades separating the two. It's been estimated between 2013 and 2017 that there are actually 620 breeding pairs of goshawks in the country. Now, while it's not a lot, they now have protection, they've been afforded legal protection, and the numbers are on the rise and people are hopeful. But you may ask the question, why would these predators attack grey squirrels and not go after the red ones? Well, the simple truth is that red squirrels are smaller and lighter and more nimble than the greys. Grey squirrels weigh 520 grams, whereas reds weigh only 300 grams. So they can go places that the grey squirrels simply can't. Pine martens will almost always choose a grey squirrel over a red. They're bigger, they're easier to catch, and they're a bigger meal. Any wild animal will will always choose an easy, good meal over a difficult, bad one.
That's how the pine marten gets its advantage on the greys, because they're bigger and they can't climb out to the narrow branches. They can't get away so quickly. Whereas the lighter reds, they're lighter than the pine marten. They can get away from the pine marten on the light branches.
There is evidence that the grey squirrels either leave the area or are the first food of the pine martens.
Believe it or not, pine martens actually pose less of a threat to red squirrels than grey squirrels do.
If the red squirrel doesn't have to have the threat and have to deal with the grey squirrel, they can survive losing a few to the pine marten.
What this means is that in the 19th century, when grey squirrels first arrived here on this land, they were met with a physically inferior cousin, which they could dominate in any aspect. They had a weapon, squirrelpox, and they were also met with no native predators compared to everything they were used to back home in North America. The idea of native predator reintroduction is to some degree a fantasy, I'm willing to admit, to some degree. But to me personally, I see it as the only ethical way forward, the only right way to just undo a bit of damage done by those before us. If we can do this for the future generations, then maybe we can actually bring back some of the balance that we tore from the land. Red squirrel conservationists, on the whole, do agree with me. But the problem is that predator reintroduction, it takes time. It takes years, decades, centuries, millennia. Gunshots are quick. In 1948, grey squirrels were introduced for the first time to the northwest region of Italy. The Italian population, if not suppressed by men with guns, is estimated to spread through Europe. Apparently it will reach the Western Alps by the 2030s, it will reach Switzerland by the 2060s, and central France by the 2070s. The Eurasian red squirrel population is facing a war on two fronts, a war in the north and a war in the south, with no real respite in between. It's entirely possible that I, as a single human, may outlive red squirrels as an entire species. And the idea of that, it terrifies me. Whilst professional people are paid to do what they do, and volunteers are not paid to do what they do, I'll be here just making silly little films, trying to get the facts together, trying to get the data together, to help tell a story of what the land used to be like and what it can one day be like again. At the end of the day, all I can really do is document this iconic native species and hope, just hope and hope, that one day they won't be quite as rare to come by.